Section 3 is dedicated to completing the identification of the players and some definitions around them in the U.S. trucking industry. Let's pick back up with bonded carriers. We actually talked about bonded carriers, especially in the module on ocean freight, as well as air freight too. We're going to bring bonded carriers back into the fold as an important part of domestic on-forwarding. Fairly specialized, but important nonetheless. A bonded carrier is a trucking company that is licensed to move cargo in bond from a specific U.S. pickup location to a specific destination. Remember, in bond means that goods are physically in the country, but they haven't cleared through customs yet. They haven't entered into the commerce of the United States, to go back to one of our customs brokerage terms. Bonded carriers are moving stuff around under specific licenses issued by USCBP that allows them to move goods that are in the country physically but haven't entered into the commerce of the country. Some examples to refresh our memory: it could be delivery to and or withdrawal from a bonded warehouse or foreign trade zone, FTZs, which we talked about quite frequently also. Second sub-bullet, it might be introducing some more terminology that we spoke of, transportation related to the immediate export, an IE, of goods under bond. For example, where goods arrive to LAX airport from somewhere in Asia, they're going to be on-forwarded to somewhere in Latin America via air freight. The cargo has to be moved from one carrier to another, an air carrier. That's done under an IE. That physical move has to be done by a bonded carrier. We also talked about bonded carriers providing transportation related to the transportation and exportation of goods under bond. That's similar to an IE, you will recall, but it's where goods might arrive to an LAX, for example, and are then trucked down to Miami. That's the exact example that we used, actually, for re-export into Latin America. It's certainly not limited to LA or Miami. It could be anywhere. It could be New York to Chicago, any variety of combinations of cities. But it's the physical movement of goods under bond by a bonded carrier from one port or airport, typically to another. That's a T&E. Bonded carriers have to do that. Within the context of domestic on-forwarding, they can play an important role. Drayage companies. We've spoken frequently of them. We're going to bring them back into the story as well. These are trucking companies or owner-operators, single individuals that provide services that specialize in the short-haul movement of ocean containers to and from a port or rail facility. Drayage is always going to be specific to ocean freight and or rail transportation. We'll see lots of that in upcoming examples. Here's one we haven't talked about much, and freight brokers do play an important role in the U.S. trucking ecosystem, and that is a person or an entity which arranges for the transportation of property by a motor carrier for compensation. What does that mean? A freight broker doesn't own any assets, any power units, tractors essentially, any trailers. They're out brokering business, matching up loads with drivers. Freight brokerage, kind of like a freight forwarder for trucking in the United States, is a vital and vibrant business within the U.S. trucking industry. As a quick subpoint, freight brokers do not transport the property nor assume liability for loss or damage. Freight brokers are a middle person, once again, matching up loads with drivers all around the country. One point that has provided both competition and perhaps competitive advantage for freight brokers is something born of the internet age called load board operators. These are companies that operate on the internet that are fee-based websites that match drivers with available loads, even to the point where apps are available on a smartphone or a tablet, and truckers, even owner-operators, can go on to a load board and see what loads are available. If a trucker is in Oklahoma City after just dropping off a load and is looking for a backhaul load to, say, Memphis, Tennessee, they can go onto a load board as a participating member of that board, a vetted member of that load board, and contract for timing, for price, etc. Load boards, as one might imagine, have played an increasingly important role in the U.S. trucking industry. Owner-operators, we see them in drayage, we see them in long-haul domestic transportation. These are individuals, people who own and operate his or her own equipment, their own power unit, that's the tractor, and trailer. And they work around the country in different regions, maybe long haul, maybe short haul, but they are a small business owner. And they contract with different entities, maybe a load board, a freight broker for sure, to keep their assets running. A freight forwarder. Here's an old favorite from international, but of course freight forwarders these days, as they try to integrate, as they try to expand their service portfolio and integrate domestic services with international services, can get involved in domestic transportation. They're slightly removed, especially if they're not freight brokerage companies themselves or common carriers themselves, but they're in the game for sure. Let's remind ourselves that a freight forwarder is a person or entity which holds itself out to the general public to provide transportation of property for compensation, and in the ordinary course of business, a person or an entity which arranges for the transportation of property by a motor carrier for compensation. That's an official definition, as you might have discerned. Key phrases here: an entity which arranges for the transportation of property by a motor carrier, not themselves, by a motor carrier. Let's say that freight forwarders and freight brokers are not the same thing. Freight brokers have to be approved and licensed, essentially, by the U.S. Department of Transportation. Freight forwarders are not the same thing. What do? As we see in our sub-bullet point, a freight forwarder assembles and consolidates or provides for assembling and consolidating shipments, meaning using a third party, and performs break, bulk, and distribution operations of the shipments. Freight forwarders, especially when they don't operate their own equipment or are not licensed as common carriers or freight brokers, are a little bit removed from domestic trucking. They can arrange for it. They'll likely tack on a fee for arranging that transportation, but it's not them that's necessarily providing the service. Last sub-bullet, freight forwarders do assume responsibility for the transportation from the place of receipt to the place of destination. That is different from a freight broker. What else do we have? Some important U.S. government entities that we need to know about. The Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, that's an agency within the U.S. Department of Transportation that is charged with preventing commercial motor vehicle injuries and fatalities. Why do we mention them? Well, because number one, in our sub-bullet, they process applications for permits to operate as a freight forwarder or broker, and manage applications for Mexico-domiciled motor carriers to operate in foreign commerce. What does that mean? Mexican truckers that can cross the border on a limited basis, distance-wise, from the border into the United States. The DOT, Department of Transportation, is the overarching government entity that is in charge of trucking in the United States. Certification and licensing of common carriers, FTL versus LTL, etc., etc. The FMCA is within the Department of Transportation, and needless to say, safety is important to all of us. Let's move on to a non-government entity called the National Motor Freight Traffic Association, the NMFTA. Super important, especially as it relates to LTL cargo. They are a nonprofit organization comprised of motor carriers engaged in U.S. interstate, that's crossing state lines, intrastate, transportation within a single state, and foreign commerce, meaning trucking to and from Canada, to and from Mexico. It's quite critical to talk about the NMFTA because it's going to come up again as it relates to the classification of freight, how the trucking industry in the LTL space deals with dense versus voluminous cargo. As we see in our first sub-bullet, the NMFTA is the publisher of a methodology for the classification of freight, and it's completely different from air freight and ocean freight, talking about making distinctions and pricing that accommodates dense versus voluminous cargo. The theme is the same. Is cargo dense? Is it voluminous? Are they ball bearings in a shipment, or are they ping pong balls? That same old theme we've been talking about. How that is accounted for in the trucking industry is completely different from ocean and air freight. The NMFTA publishes this methodology. Of course, we're going to get to how that methodology works in upcoming sections. The NMFTA also assigns transportation companies with what are called SCAC codes, or the Standard Carrier Alpha Code. That's a number that's assigned to carriers. And the NMFTA also manages the standard point location code. Basically, the matching of zip codes from origin to destination in any combination possible in the entire United States. That's a pretty heavy undertaking, but that's what they do. Wrapping up this section, we'll talk about a company that was actually born of the days of truck regulation called FMCA. Pretty interesting stuff. It is a for-profit company located on the outskirts of Atlanta, Georgia, that provides the LTL industry with base rate comparisons for all zip code pairs in the U.S. What the heck does that mean? Well, number one, during the age of trucking regulation, FMCA was actually a rate bureau in the southeastern United States that compiled and published fixed rates in the southeast. They have a long and storied history. But of course, regulation took away rate bureaus. FMCA morphed into a for-profit company. What do they do? Second sub-bullet, they provide base rates as well as bidding and planning tools. Base rates are the per 100-pound rates from which trucking companies, LTL trucking companies, and actual shippers can negotiate actual rates, which are typically driven by heavy discounts. The question becomes, discounts off of what? And how can all the trucking companies be singing off of the same sheet of music in terms of quoting their customers? That's what base rates are. We will talk lots about base rates in upcoming sections. There are 5,000 members of the FMCA. The carriers themselves, shippers are involved, freight management companies, etc. As a quick note, Mercado has no affiliation whatsoever with FMCA. We bring them up because they're really important, because they provide the base rates, the same sheet of music off of which carriers and shippers can begin to negotiate their LTL rates. That's it for Section 3. Upon our return, we start to get into the deep operational components of these various modes of on-forwarding, starting with drayage. We shall see you shortly.